Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to today's Sikh Network show. On last week's show, we showed the launch of the Sikh survey. So on today's show, what we're going to be doing is discussing some of the contents of the Sikh survey, and also in terms of what follow-up action has resulted from the Sikh survey. So today with me, I've got Jaswinder Singh Katka.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
So before we really kick into the UK Sikh survey, Jas, obviously there might be some new viewers to today's program. So very quickly, can you just give us a summary of what the Sikh Network is and the UK Sikh survey?
Sure. So the Sikh Network really is a collective. It is what it says. It's a network of not only Sikhs but also of non-Sikhs, and it's something that we started a bunch of professionals. We looked at the Sikh organisations and people that were working in the space, and felt that we needed to do more to attract younger professionals, talented individuals that weren't either coming through established organisations or Gurdwara institutes, but felt they wanted to contribute something. So we started the network in about 2014 as a concept of how do we attract individuals and help to build them around a single focus area. And as that gained momentum, we found it was quite popular and people wanted to support and give their seva. We then focused it around the Sikh Manifesto because we had the general election in 2015. And what we felt was a Sikh community, we were really underrepresented, not only in politicians, but also our issues. So the network really then focused around one agenda, and that was the Sikh Manifesto. And that helped us spread the word of actually what it was we were bringing. We did a consultative approach to get the ideas of many Sikhs, and many contributed to the actual manifesto itself. And that's really was the foundation stones of what the network was about. And since then, we've moved on to bigger programs and projects. We do the Gurpurab event, Guru Nanak Dev Ji's Gurpurab event, every year in Parliament now. We've done that for 2 years running. And now, as we're going to talk about today, we launched the UK Sikh survey, which is the largest and most comprehensive survey of Sikhs in the UK to date.
Right, you're right. So Sikh Network in itself is, like I said, a network. Yeah. So it's not actually any organisation or organisation structure. But I suppose you're right, because we had the Sikh Manifesto with a lot of sort of campaigns. It's very hard in terms of actually monitoring progress against what we're trying to achieve. So in a way, the Sikh Network's good in terms of a focused approach, in terms of these were the objectives within the Sikh Manifesto. Absolutely. Actually, how far are we progressing in that?
And that was one of the things that when we did the sort of assessment, we looked at it thinking, there's a lot of effort goes on. And we always have to remember, a lot of the Sikh organisations do it as voluntary. It's seva, so they all have full-time jobs, as do or everyone in the network. But so it's about finding that balance of making the most value of the seva that you put in. But really to do that, you have to be self-critical in sometimes and actually put some milestones and objectives, things that you do in your day-to-day business lives.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of things that we try to bring in the way we operate. So behind the network, behind the scenes, there is a really wide, diverse team. But we regular catch up. We'll have a conference call, we have video conferencing, there's update meetings that we have. But we keep the Sangat informed. So we set ourselves objectives in the manifesto. Although there's 10 points, we had 4 issues that were the priority for the next year and a half. And then we have a quarterly newsletter, which we issued last week. And that now goes to over 4,500 people that are part of the network. And that quarterly newsletter is our way of keeping the Sangat updated on progress, but also what are the future plans and where direction we're going. So that gives us that feedback and also highlights opportunities where other people who are observers of what we're doing may want to get more actually involved. And again, the door's always open, and we're very pleased to see that we do get a regular load of contacts from individuals wanting to be part of it.
Excellent. So that's the short summary of the Sikh Network, and I think it's important that we did that on a regular basis. So people that are joining or looking at the show for the first time are actually aware of who the network is. Now moving swiftly on. We had the launch of the UK Sikh survey last week, and a lot of viewers actually saw that. We had some very excellent speakers, prominent speakers actually there, and we're grateful to the University of Wolverhampton that actually helped with the launch itself. So what were the key findings in the UK Sikh survey?
So the survey, as you mentioned, the launch went down very well. We actually had the VC, Vice Principal of the University, open the launch. I think what that did was give it the credibility that it weren't just the Sikh community or a group in the Sikh community did the survey. It was actually an academic piece of work,
Certainly,
and it stands on its own feet in terms of the analysis, the research and the findings. And if we look at the findings, they're really identified into sort of 5 key areas. Political, so what is the Sikh position in terms of the UK political setup and structures? Identity, which we all know is very core to our faith, but what are the day-to-day issues that Sikhs are sort of coming to terms with or facing directly or indirectly regards their identity, and that's both male and female and the younger and elder generations. Discrimination and hate crime, which is very topical in the UK, was a key output of the survey. Our general contribution, so that's more from a positive angle. What does the community provide, not only to Sikhs and our fellow Sikhs, but also the wider public and society? And importantly, on human rights, again, a cornerstone of the Sikh faith. What are some of the findings around human rights and our duty and obligations to pursue those? So they were the key areas that we touched on, and then we can go into some of the details.
So okay, in terms of you touched on the political issue. I mean, what was the, and I know, having looked at the UK Sikh survey, some of the results were really, really interesting in terms of how we can take things forward. So in terms of the survey itself, in terms of politically, what were some of the key stats that actually came out?
So some of them are very interesting. Some of them we knew well. So following on from the manifesto, which is really the first engaging aspect, we allowed us to test how politically active Sikhs are. And for years, if we take the main obvious one, is that we don't have any Sikh MPs. And that Labour have no Sikh, either MP or peer, in the House of Lords. That's just fact. And what we do know, what we have known, is that Sikhs are very active politically, in that there is a higher turnout to vote on any elections.
Right, okay.
And historic general elections, referendums have always shown that Sikhs have a high percentage. And I think 82 out of our survey, 82% is the turnout, which is a lot higher than the national average, which is around 66%. So we actually then, what that means is that we have a greater say than our numbers.
And it shows we're actually politically active.
We recognise what the power of democracy and the vote means, in that actually how to influence changes to go out and vote. So that's quite important. And what we tried to drive out of the survey and the manifesto was that political parties recognise that as well. Because that's when it starts to become more useful and powerful, is when others who use this data start to discover that Sikhs are a lot greater than their numbers in terms of their influencing in elections.
No, certainly. So I'm just looking at the survey now. It's interesting, like you said, 82% of Sikhs. But then if you look at the black minority ethnic turnout, that was 50%. And then you look at the national average of 66%. So it just shows, you're right, it shows that actually, if you look at it from a national average perspective, we are higher than the national average.
And there is this sort of disengagement nationally, if not internationally, with politics, and people are feeling whether they're engaged or disengaged, or how they want to exercise a protest vote. So, but I think for Sikhs to have such a high rate of turnout, I think it's such a strong sign that we do think it's important, whether they're community issues or national issues of interest, that we do have a say in those. And I think that was demonstrated very well. One thing that also came out is that one thing we've heard from all political parties is that it's always been a bounce back to the community, that you need to join political parties.
Right,
if you want to see candidates, if you want to see MPs, then you need to join more, be part of the process. And we certainly had that when we were doing the manifesto. But interestingly, what the survey threw back was Sikhs are 5 times more likely than any other community to already be a member of a political party. So it's not the issue that we're not, we actually are. And some of the figures, when we looked at the 2 main political parties, the Conservatives and Labour, percentage-wise they were fairly equal, about 5 and 6% membership are from the Sikh community. But obviously Labour have a much greater number of members. But it just shows that we are actively members, and if you look across the data, we actually are represented at councillor level, both male and female, and of the younger generation. So that's a response back to the parties to say, well, actually, Sikhs are members, and they're more likely to become a member of a party than anyone else. So that doesn't fly anymore, just to bat it back.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, because that's a really interesting piece of stat, really, because sometimes we shoot ourselves to say, look, we haven't got any politicians, and then the political parties come back and say, actually, we're not politically active, you're not becoming members of parties. But this actually shows, a sample survey, I must say, before we go further, it's a sample survey that shows that there's a higher percentage of Sikhs that are members of both parties than the national average from that perspective. So the question then comes, actually, is it a problem just from a Sikh perspective? And we touch on discrimination later on. But it brings to face the fact that actually the critical mass is there on the ground, but there's something stopping them being converted into prospective candidates.
And this is the thing, and that's one spectrum that we're more likely to become members. There is another end of that spectrum, which should be a worry to other political parties, in that when we talk about disengagement generally, then Sikhs are higher than the national average. So 39% of Sikhs from our survey who felt disengaged with politics were not attracted, that they just didn't feel attracted at all or completely disengaged, and that's higher than the national average. So on the one side, we're very active, but of our community, because every community has a section of it, those that aren't politically active, it's a greater number. So, but that also is a great opportunity as well that they should target.
Yeah, you're right. But I think the challenge for us from these stats is one, very much in terms of, to political parties, it's saying, look, there are members of both parties. Actually, the question, and there are a number of councillors from each of the parties. Now, the question you want to ask is, well, actually, if you reflect on that, a lot of politicians, members of parliament, were actually actively involved in the political field before they became politicians. So from our perspective, in terms of one of the things this survey shows up, there's a number of Sikhs that are already politically active. We've got a number of councillors, but there isn't that leap from councillors or being politically active to being prospective candidates.
And that's the focus now, certainly up until 2020, if not before, if there's election.
But again, from my background in terms of working on sort of issues of inequality and underrepresentation, then I think for us, the Sikhs as a whole, and especially those people that are members of political parties and councillors as well, we should be actually challenging our political parties to say, what is the issue? There's a barrier. What is that barrier? How do we overcome that barrier? Is that barrier due to institutionalized discrimination? Because it could be that the setup or the structure of the way prospective candidates are chosen, actually there's an issue in terms of that's creating a barrier. So I think, one of the things that really came out for me from this survey was actually to say, actually we need to really challenge, or have that conversation.
I think
what
it's done is put the spotlight on it. And what it's also done, it's sort of debunked some of the myths that were easier for the political parties to use, i.e. Sikhs aren't members, or you need to join more. So it dispelled some of those responses. It's now made them look a lot harder. And I think Sikhs have an obligation as well, certainly those who are members, and certainly those who are either were candidates last year, at the last election, or prospective candidates, to really be confident, but also have that conversation and dialogue and actually be a bit more demanding. I mean, we have the talent, we have the caliber, and that's not just for representing Sikhs, but representing the UK society. But I think it's now using not only the data, but having that conversation to see, are there any challenges, are there any obstacles for them to progress, and push that as much as we can. But what we do know from the feedback we've had from all the political parties is that they're very conscious of it. So now having this data, having it as obvious as it has been, there is now, and it's not only it's on the agenda, but certainly they're very conscious of it. And now it's up to those Sikh candidates and all of the Sikh organisations to rally and support, ensure we get the right candidates going forward.
No, you're right. I suppose, and I know we need to move on, but I suppose that the important thing what I'd pick up from this very much in terms of the fact that we've got a survey actually allows you to go into any discussion and conversation with some stats.
Absolutely.
Rather than anecdotal evidence. You're actually going in and saying, well, actually, we did a survey, and this is what the survey is showing. So we're not just talking anecdotally, but we've got the stats to show it. And let's start that discussion. I mean, some of the other issues you touched on was identity.
Yeah, and identity is something that's been important, and something which everyone, all the viewers watching, whether they're whatever generation they're from, male or female, would have come across some challenges around Sikh identity in the past. Whether it's the kakar, whether it's the star turban, or whether it's just generally because we're brown skinned in this country, there will be some issues around how we've been perceived and identified. And I think identity goes beyond just the physical identity, because that's for Sikhs, it is very clear. But actually in this country, identity comes from the legal definitions. And what we wanted to capture was, how do people feel comfortable identifying themselves?
Certainly, yeah.
So recently, or historically, we've either been Indian, more recently the term Asian is popular, and that has its own issues, and we cover those in the manifesto, in how it brushes a whole section of South India, and that's not appropriate either. So we wanted to be very specific and ask questions around, what do British Sikhs want to be identified as? And overwhelmingly...
Well, you've just actually, if I just cut in, you actually identified an issue, which is British Sikhs. So I suppose that comes into the equation as well, really. I mean,
yeah, well, that was
a term which we use very openly.
Yeah.
But actually, hopefully, the stats picked something up. And like you said, in terms of, one of the stats that comes here is that there was a majority of Sikhs in Britain and abroad in the UK.
Yeah.
And the 2011 census came up with, I think, 57%. Well, there's analysis of that, but you told me that.
So effectively, our survey, what it showed was 91% of Sikhs have a British nationality.
All right, okay, 91%.
91%
of the survey, yeah,
of Sikhs now living in this country have a British nationality. And that's not actually surprising, that when you get married or people come over, they do tend to pursue the British passport nationality.
Certainly. Right.
Doesn't mean you lose any of your other identity, but it's just something that they feel connected to and stronger. And that is higher than any other the ethnic minority groups. And I think, coming from identity, we asked the question, how would you as an individual want to be identified? 19 out of 20 Sikhs, this goes across the gender, across the age spectrum, all responded with, I would be identified as a Sikh. So effectively, not Asian. Given their choices, it was Asian, Indian or Sikh. Sikh was overwhelmingly chosen. 19 out of 20 options chose the word Sikh. That's the way they want to be identified. And what this goes back to directly for this government is that in this country, ethnicity and categorization is stemmed from the census. Census is done every 10 years. And in that, although legally, and you'll know the law history around this and case history, 1983, Mandela versus Lee, Sikhs are legally classed in this country as both a race and a religion. And I think many people can get confused or have missed that fact, because the focus has largely been on religion, and it is a faith, but actually we have dual recognition in both a faith group and an ethnic group. So from an ethnicity point of view, we should always be considered in every ethnicity type question. But for one reason or another, it's been overlooked in the census. Therefore, what that's led to is that there's been no data. So Sikhs as an ethnicity has never been recorded, and actually is discriminatory against their own laws, but and we'll come on to that as we move forward. But what we want to demonstrate is that there was a big demand for it. In that Sikhs, that's how they prefer to be identified, and that's the most appropriate definition. And it's actually legally the appropriate definition as well. So that's what that sort of question led to, and that's the findings really highlighted to us. It was really strong.
So I suppose the important thing from perspective is, in terms of gain, in terms of how the survey is used in future, is very much you've got an stats saying, actually, do you know what, we did a sample survey and 19 out of 26 preferred to be identify themselves as Sikh rather than Indian or Asian. And taking that forward, really. And
this sort of moves forward with whether there's a need for the community to have a separate tick box in the census. And again, some of the community feedback we did, and sort of when we spoke to people, hardly anyone knew that we weren't.
Right.
So there was this misunderstanding. They were unaware that we weren't categorised in the census. Therefore, officially, we still don't know how many Sikhs live in this country. But what was interesting in the last census, 2011 census, is that 84,000 Sikhs effectively demonstrated a protest vote. Because the category didn't exist, they ticked other, then manually wrote Sikh. Now 84,000 is a huge number to have done that. And that demonstrates again the need and the demand from the Sikh community. What the survey has done is actually quantified it in a statistically relevant sample, which goes across all sections of the UK and is now, as you mentioned, something that we can use in various conversations.
Certainly, and I'm sure at a later stage we'll go into more detail in terms of all those findings and the impact those has in terms of policies. But moving swiftly on, another category you identified was discrimination. Again, do you want to go into some of the stats on that?
Discrimination and hate crime is something that's been very topical. And if you think about what's going on in wider UK society, so the Prime Minister in August 16 launched the race audit. So that's a government, through the Cabinet Office, it's a review of all government departments in terms of the ethnicity makeup of all of their staff in government. Also, last year, the Hate Crime Action Plan was launched. Now, coming on to the latter, that was quite disappointing in that it didn't cover Sikhs. In the analysis and the survey assessment that was done, largely ignored Sikhs. It focused very much on the Muslim community, Islamophobic crime, Jewish community, and some on the Christian community. Now, we're in conversations with the Cabinet Office around actually why were Sikhs excluded, given that there's two or three of the high-profile cases that made the mainstream news were attacks on Sikhs. So it is, and there was also a death of an elderly gentleman in Coventry. So hate crime and discrimination is massively important. But if we separate the two, from our survey, discrimination is something that happens either without you knowing, and it happens very publicly as well. And some of the questions that were quite surprising actually were 1 in 7 Sikhs are discriminated in the workplace. And given that we have strong Race Relations Act, and this is an area that you've sort of worked in, but this is quite alarming in that 1 in 7 Sikhs have faced discrimination the last 12 months in the workplace. Now that could be, and when we look at the detail behind it, that's all industries, government, civil service, it's financial services, it's across the board. So this is something that whether it's down to the physical identity, whether it's the colour of the skin, whether there's other factors which are discriminatory, but the point is people have identified it and have used the survey to exercise their opinions on it.
Certainly, because that actually throws up another question really in terms of, actually it's another opportunity for another survey, in-depth survey. Yeah. Because like I said, in terms of 1 in 7 Sikhs directly experience discrimination in the workplace. Now, that could be perceived discrimination or actual discrimination. Yeah. And I think there needs to be some real research gone into this to actually look at, is it a perception of discrimination? Is it actual discrimination? And actually, how many cases have actually gone to a tribunal?
And this is the issue that we have.
That because is really interesting.
Because stuff we talked about at the start around recording, because no companies are monitoring Sikhs in their ethnic diversity monitoring, if a Sikh feels discriminated, it's most likely going to get misreported.
As religious discrimination, most likely.
And then you've got the fact of, are we as a community, do we report these things? Or do we just take it on the chin and just persevere with it?
But more importantly, I think it's actually, do we understand what discrimination is? You know, indirect discrimination, direct discrimination, victimization, harassment. Yeah. So I think what this shows is that actually, and that's the whole idea of surveys. Surveys there as a starting point to say actually this is some of the high level findings. Yeah. And actually if it brings something up like this has done, it shows that there needs to be in-depth research or some more surveys to be done in this piece of work really. Absolutely. And I think that's stressed up. I suppose my challenge out there to academics is that actually here's a piece of work that needs to be done. And I think academics need to raise to the challenge. And actually there's a lot of funding out there that's available to look at these issues. And there's a need to actually have some in-depth research done on the types of discrimination that the Sikhs face, because they certainly do, according to these samples. They do,
and it's the same it's actually even worse in public places.
Right, okay.
I think it's 1 in 5 Sikhs have faced discrimination in a public place. Now that can be in very visual cases that we've all dealt with when Sikhs are denied entry into the London Eye, into various public institutes, whether it's because of the Gurban or other issues of identity. But Lord's Cricket Ground was another one of these. So there are public institutes out there. Schools another. We've regularly had cases where inadvertently, rather down to sort of either being ill-informed, people have made discriminatory decisions against Sikhs, and they've had to get involved and sort of resolve those. But what it shows is that whether it's from police officers, because that was also mentioned there, whether it's from public officials, there is this level of education need for them to understand, because a lot of what we see, some of it is inadvertent, they just don't know. Some of it is ignorance, some of it is targeting. And I think it's important to understand and dig deeper under these figures.
Certainly, yeah.
And get to some of those case files and then work towards applicable solutions that are needed.
No, certainly. And again, we're of the time. So the other thing you touched on was contribution.
Yeah, I think there's just one thing we should mention because it was one of the headlines. As the survey went across the mainstream media, one of the things they did pick out was the 100,000 reported hate crimes.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
And again, this is something that when we extrapolated the data, because we asked the question, have you experienced a hate crime? And hate crime could be anything from being sworn at on the street, car driving by, we've all had it, someone just shouting a derogatory term at you, to actually a physical attack. And I think, again, it comes down to Sikhs have always resisted reporting these things. I know I have.
Right.
As an individual, you just either you challenge it, which is a typical Sikh response. Anyone who says anything, I've heard it at the back, whether in the cinema or the class or you're walking down the street. First thing I do is turn around and say, excuse me.
Yeah.
And you might follow up with something, but you will challenge it. And then what that does is it puts people back and then it sort of diffuses the situation. Now, others may not challenge it, but they'll just go with it and they ride with it. And we take a lot on the chin as a community and we don't report things. And there's sort of pros and cons of that approach, but ultimately what it doesn't do, it doesn't record the volume of hate crime that is out there. What the survey did was ask very specific questions, and it allowed a Sikh who not necessarily had reported it either at a police reporting centre or at the police station to actually air their views. And we were surprised with the volume of it. And actually, this is something that's alarming for the government and public bodies, that they only need to address the volume of hate crime. They've taken action on a lot lower numbers from other communities, but also improve reporting of how the Sikh community is able to go and report these crimes and how it's more approachable for us as a community to report these and then have the follow-on action. So that's a major focus point of the survey.
No, certainly, yeah, it's very interesting really, because remember in UK legislation, UK case law, there's already legislation in place, which is the incitement to religious hatred and incitement to racial hatred. So there's a piece of legislation already in place to address some of those issues of discrimination. But what this survey is showing, actually, maybe there's 2-3 things that have actually come out of this. One is very much in terms of reporting. Are they actually reported? Secondly, is the legislation actually working for Sikhs in that perspective, in terms of racial hatred, incitement to racial crime, hatred, and also religious hatred. So I think that's important. And again, like you said, high-level survey stats, and actually needs to dig into it deeper. But it does show that actually a number of actions actually can come out of as a result of the survey itself. Contributions.
So I think it's widely been accepted and acknowledged that the Sikh community have made a huge contribution to British society, not only today but also in the past. And it's something that, again, in the Sikh manifesto, we recognised the contribution of the Sikh soldiers in the World War I and World War II. And in terms of 83,000 turban-wearing Sikhs died for the freedom of Britain and European allies. And there should be a recognition of that fact. And we're working on an initiative around a permanent monument in central London to mark that. But we wanted to know how many people had a family or relative who fought in the war directly. So that makes that direct connection. And 22% of the people we surveyed had a relative in the First World War, and 34% had a relative in the Second World War. So a fairly large percentage of our British Sikh population now living here had a family member that was active or who played a part in both world wars. And that's something that's we do recognise, and I think also the Ministry of Defence and also the Armed Services have acknowledged, but I think at a national scale should also be not only proud of, but should also to do something a lot more and manage and recognise that fact. Certainly.
And it's interesting in terms of for our own younger generation to give them a self-belonging, the fact that actually their forefathers actually contributed to the freedom of this country.
Absolutely. Especially when you look at a post-Brexit UK now, and
certainly,
a lot of the conversations that are coming out around a focus on immigrants particularly, and actually their contribution, or actually Sikhs, their contribution doesn't just go back 30, 40, 50 years, actually, it was about the definition of the borders of the UK and Britain.
It was.
Defending those. So actually, knowing that, and this is something that when I grew up, we did all history, but this is the contribution of Sikh and other ethnic minority communities' contribution to the war was just completely overlooked. Completely overlooked. And I think highlighting it, and there's a lot of initiatives that are going on now, and the Anglo-Sikh War, and bringing out the 1914 Sikhs that are bringing this to the fore. It's important that it gets into the curriculum. So having our own community know it, and then working with those in education to bring it into the mainstream curriculum, that this sort of messages helps then with the ignorance and awareness generally that we are seeing that drives the discriminatory aspects we talked about earlier, can then be
which is interesting because you mentioned that. I mean, sharing with the viewers. I mean, my niece recently, my cousin rang me up and said her daughter actually was doing some work at school on World War I, World War II, and I think she's about 8 or 9 or 10. Right. And my great-great-grandfather fought in World War I. Right. And we've actually got the medals, which is ironic because, like anything in Punjab, right, we were there cleaning the Haveli, and out of nowhere, there were some medals lying around, and we had those, and we actually got them ribboned. But it's interesting in terms of now she's actually going to take those ribbons to school because she wants to take them to school, and it would be her great nana who actually went to the World War.
And it's great.
So it's interesting from that perspective.
Exactly, especially when you look back through the contribution of our elders, both in this country in terms of the economic migrants that came here, in terms of the steelwork, especially in the West Midlands, but also the textile industry. So Sikhs have had a positive contribution, both historically, but also in the current climate, in modern days. I mean, a huge statistic in that 1.2 million pounds a day is donated to Sikhs, to charities. That's 1.2 million a day. That a small minority, 1% of the population in this country, we estimate that 1.2 million is given, and to all charities. So that's to Sikh charities in the UK, that's Sikh charities abroad, that's non-Sikh charities in the UK, and also non-Sikh charities abroad. So across the spectrum of all charitable organisations are out there, Sikhs give openly. And again, it's not a surprise because that's one thing is part of our faith, and it's an important part of it. But when you look at the numbers and you compare it to what is going on as a community, it is quite a proud statistic to learn that this is how.
Okay, moving on, is there anything else from the survey at a high level that we should discuss?
One of the other key things was really around human rights. And again, it's an important factor of the faith, but it's also an important part of the Sikh manifesto in that we have outstanding issues that are important to Sikhs in the UK as well as wider Sikhs, in that actually there are atrocities that have gone on in the past. 1984, both June, November, genocides are outstanding for both truth and justice. And I think it's important that we get, as British Sikhs that live in here, we work with our government to ensure that the right level of truth is exposed. And I think the two real cases that came out one was around a further investigation into the British government's role in 1984, in terms of what role they played in the advice that was given in attack on Operation Blue Star.
So actually the stats think that 93% think that the UK government should support a UN-led inquiry into the 1984 Sikh genocide. So it just shows that actually there's a demand out there.
There is a demand, and again, 97% or say that there should be 92% said there should be an independent inquiry into the UK's role, because that's something that's within our control. Certainly, but also, like I said, the 93 would certainly push for a UN-led inquiry. So this does broaden it out, that it's not just a small minority of Sikhs that are really questioning. Human rights is fundamental, and that goes across all of our views.
No, certainly. Is there anything else?
I think that's the key things from the findings of the survey. And the survey is available. I mean, it's online. It's at the SikhNetwork.com website. It's on our social media. So download the survey. It's all of the statistics and the infographics are out there. People are free to use which bits that they feel relevant to either their local research or further research. As you mentioned, there's enough areas that would warrant a review within themselves, and we can certainly share the data with people and sort of give them our perspective. And then the important thing on the survey, I'd say, is it is the largest survey done to date. 4,500 Sikhs across the UK responded, and we covered all of the 12 regions of the UK. So it wasn't just the West Midlands or Southall. We covered Northern Ireland, Scotland, North East, North West, South West. So all the 12 regions of the UK were covered, and we covered a huge demographic of age in terms of 16 and over, all the way up to over 60s. So I think we were quite pleased with the coverage, because that's important. And I think we also were quite specific and focused on getting a view across the Sikh spectrum. So those that are more practicing Orthodox Sikhs to those that are just earlier on in their journey, who would just have a specific view on certain things, might not be wearing the kakars, but it was important to get their views, because they're a huge portion of our as well. That's what we captured with that.
Certainly, and I think from my perspective, in terms of my professional background and where I sort of work on, I've spent most of my life in terms of policy development and working on policy, and when you're actually there developing policy, be it public sector policy, private sector policy, or policy on any issue, one of the first things you do is actually look at research and collect data. Because if you're going to develop any type of policy, you need some hard evidence or some evidence of data that's available out there to actually back up any policies you actually develop or draft. So I think this is excellent, and I must say this is really useful in terms as a snapshot and as a first step. Because I know a lot of people get skeptical of saying things, but the reality is you've got to start somewhere. And this is a starting step where actually now Sikhs that are in conversation with people that develop policy can actually talk with facts and figures.
I mean, you have a baseline now. So what we've done is set the baseline. Now, we'll periodically review and we'll conduct further surveys, but you now have a baseline data that you then work to, and you can then track the movement. And that's what we've seen now with some of the sessions that we've had going forward. I
mean, we've had the launch of the Sikh survey. We've had a discussion today on some of the key findings of the Sikh survey. I mean, what have you done? Have you actually had any meetings with government departments or civil servants or any public institutions?
Yeah, so that was the objectives of the survey when we published it was primarily to work with public bodies to help educate and drive policy decisions and use the right data. And we've had a huge response, and it's been very positive from all departments. We held a cross-government workshop at the Home Office in DCLG and Marsh Street in London on the 20th of December, I believe it was, where a number of government departments were invited. So we had DCLG there, DCSMS, the Home Office, the Foreign Office came, the Lord Mayor of London sent representatives. We had representatives from the police and also TfL and Department of Education. So really cross-government. I may have missed a few off, but it was really informative, because we wanted to have rather than a public launch and hear a load of speeches, we wanted to get in depth in some of the findings that were specific to those departments and actually walk them through. And I think that was really quite powerful, actually having those in the room to have a real Q&A and have a more in-depth discussion for them to then take away and understand the data in the survey, and for them to think about how they need to go back and either change policy within their departments or how they interact with the wider public in terms of their public-facing side of the department. So that was hugely successful, and we've covered that in this quarter's survey as well. So the details of that are in there. The key outputs.
In the survey,
in the newsletter.
I think you're right, because I was privileged enough to actually be there at that meeting and actually talk about some of the issues, especially in terms of discrimination, which is my background. And it was really interesting in terms of talking to civil servants and people there who are actually at the ground level of developing policy and actually sharing this survey. So I thought it was really useful in taking steps forward, really.
It is, and I think and then off the back of that, people who were there in attendance went back and took notes and followed up with the network, and we've set up follow-up sessions with people in the Cabinet Office specifically around policy, because they are now, so for the race audit, for example, we met with the lady who's heading up the race audit for the Prime Minister's office and talked to her about what was her scope, because what clearly was apparent very clearly was that Sikhs weren't included, because they were using the census categories for ethnicity definition. Because what we talked about earlier, that Sikhs aren't in that, then ultimately what you're saying is you won't be looking at Sikhs going forward. And she was very receptive and open to the conversation that we had. We outlined both the legal position, but also the right thing to do, in that this is a large section of the community. So they're now taking that feedback on board, and will look at how they can ensure that Sikhs are included. We've been in conversation with Maria Miller, who's head of the Women's Inequality subcommittee,
Select committee,
and who's written to Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, and we had responses from them. So it is at the top level of government, but also at the operating level that we're now working with these departments. And we've also had a positive meeting with Parliament. So people see Parliament, they see the MPs in the houses, but actually there's a huge back office to Parliament. And the good news is they are already changing the way they record, and Sikhs will be recorded going forward. So what we've seen is we're going to continue to work with those, and there's a lot of work to be done in terms of we get it widespread. But what we're seeing is because of the survey and the headlines that they made and the media coverage that we got from it, that other people are picking up themselves, and they are seeing the change and they're building that in. But the other big aspect we wanted to work with was the ONS, because fundamentally the census drives a lot of data collection in this country. And we've been in dialogue with the Office of National Statistics for about 6 months, if not longer now, in ensuring that we are ahead of the game for 2021, which is likely to be the last census, that the Sikh category and the ethnicity is included. And again, we're quite positive. In the conversation we had to date, they are certainly accommodating more. Some of the issues they had in previous years around space will be less of an issue this time. And they are now looking to test the Sikh category. So they will be doing a test in 2 regions, which they'll be deciding in the next week or 2, where there's a big Sikh population, so likely to be either somewhere in the south or in the Midlands, and they will be testing that. So it's important that any Sikh who does get, and we'll do a specific show on this maybe next week or the week after around what to do and how to respond to that. But what we've certainly seen is engaging with the ONS early, having the survey as a real statistical piece of reference data has been helpful and powerful, and that we actually frame the conversations more from anecdotal to a real community demand with evidence. So that's really where we are, and we'll continue to sort of push these conversations going forward.
Certainly. And in terms of sharing the UK Sikh survey across internally within our own community, because obviously there's a lot of stats there which our own community might not be aware of. And I'm thinking more in terms of some of the Sikh professionals we have who might not be aware of this, but actually can use this data, this information going forward. And secondly, very much you've touched on the external factor from a high level in terms of at a governmental level with civil servants and ministers. But how are you tending to take this forward, one, internally within the community? Let's answer that one first. And then we'll
so I think what the plan was, again, one, to make the messages really simple. So we created the infographics because it's very easy to read.
It looks really nice, I must say that.
It's eye-catching. I think what the plan is to get some large posters made, and we'll distribute them to all the Gurdwara. So working with the organisations and the Gurdwara in the UK to say, look, we'll prepare the presentation format for you guys and have that presented on the wall in the Gurdwara entrances, in the notice boards. So then the Sangat walking in and out can actually see that and connect to it and say, right, okay. So that's one part of it. I think the regular show we do here on KTV, the Sikh Network show, which is on every Mondays, I think this will be a standard platform where we will sort of bring the messages out and what's the specific issue that we've seen. But I think also general awareness for how we sort of communicate and share information. Individuals who are part of the network, who get the regular emails, for them to talk to their parents at home. Have the conversation at home, at the dinner table, or whenever you're there having this dialogue. Talk about these issues so your parents are aware of actually what discrimination is and how to report it, what race hate crime is. I think the more the younger generation engage with their elders and actually talk about how there are organisations out there, there are bodies out there that are looking at this stuff, we can connect into, share advice, I think the better. And I'll just give you one example. Last week we had a Singh contacted us. He was working for one of the major mobile operators in this country, and had an issue with his Gakar wearing the Kirpan at work. Amritari Najwan he was, and he was unaware of what the actual legislation was around this, and he sort of reached out. We responded. We gave him the Human Rights Council sort of guidance around the 5Ks. We sort of gave him a view of how he might want to progress and frame the conversation. And the good news was I heard from him Friday that they totally accepted his position.
Excellent.
He'd got HR involved and sort of explained the situation, explained the law, explained the guidance, They totally accepted it, but it was one of those that they sort of challenged it just off the face of it. But him being part of the network, or just seeing some of the stuff we've done on social media,
Certainly, yeah.
reached out to us through Facebook and said, I've got this problem, can you help? We responded, got back and said, yeah, it's great now. They've now changed their policy internally. So that's the power of just staying connected can have, and that's really what we're trying to do.
We talked about the community itself, but how are you, obviously you talked at a national level, how are you hoping to sort of communicate the survey, people making policy at a regional and a local level?
Yeah, so that's an important bit, because government is important, but it's not the only way. It's not the only controlling arm. There is local authorities of huge importance. And now with the devolution agenda, with mayoral offices, certainly in the West Midlands, and also in Manchester now with the mayoral elections happening there in the coming months and years, it's important that we engage locally. And again, recognising where we have influence. So we talked at the start about a greater number of Sikh councillors, and those councillors are members of local cabinets.
Certainly, yeah.
So I think it's important that we engage with them. They also recognise the stats, and they change things that are within their control, get changed locally, because there's ways of driving change. There's the national agenda, which is largely covers most, but can be quite slow and cumbersome, or you just go bottom up. Get in the local councils where you have influence, raise these issues, and it's a lot easier to drive that change. So what we're planning to do is regional workshops. So like we held one with the cross government, we are looking to hold one in the major regions of the UK. So we'll be sharing the dates once we've got them in the diary, but Northeast, Northwest is in discussions. Yorkshire and Humber, we're looking to go up there. West Midlands, and then the South, we're looking to get something in City Hall. So we'll invite the community into City Hall and hold an event there, and we'll educate and raise the awareness. But absolutely, I think it's important that we not only connect with the community, but also those that are active in local government, so they are aware, and they then can go away informed of what they need to do.
No, thank you. That's been really useful. Is there anything else you want to add on to this before we're in the closing?
Yeah, I think the survey is well known. It's out there. I think, again, encourage everybody to download the survey. It's on our website, sikhnetwork.com. Look at the statistics that are either important to you or you felt you've been impacted by. I mean, we've only touched on a few of the things. There's important issues around grooming and Sikh girls, and how they've been targeted by grooming gangs. Again, very important, very taboo subject, but something that absolutely, as parents, we should all be.
We'll touch on some of those issues.
We'll cover those.
Programs,
absolutely should be aware of. And I think it's important that we continue. The survey was an ASAP position. It's there. I think it's important how we look to move it forward, and the dialogue and engagement with all levels of government is important, but our community is important as well. I think the more people who share it and have discussions yourselves and give us feedback, that's the important thing, because the more feedback we get back, then we can sort of incorporate those things we missed, things we may not have asked. We've already had a load of questions that we should cover going forward, but the more feedback we get, the better things we can then take on board and build forward.
Thank you for that. And I think from our viewers' perspective, from a Sikh Network program, we had the UK Sikh survey launched last week, and what we've done this week is hopefully in terms of going into more details of actually what the UK Sikh survey said, what were the major findings, and as a result of the findings, what action has actually been taken going forward. And my sort of request to the viewers out there is that the UK Sikh survey doesn't belong to the Sikh Network, doesn't belong to any one organisation. It belongs to all of us. And my urge is that, get hold of the UK Sikh survey, go onto the Sikh Network website or Facebook site and download the UK Sikh survey and have a look at it. It's very interesting. And maybe if you're working in a professional capacity at wherever level, for example, you're a lawyer or a teacher, wherever, use this information. It's useful information in terms of taking things forward. And hopefully in future programs, we'll go into more detail in terms of what are the underlying facts for each of these issues we've discussed. And one of the things we'd really appreciate from Khalsa TV is your feedback, not only on the UK Sikh survey and the Sikh Network, but also in terms of programs we're hoping to sort of deliver to the Sangat out there itself. And lastly, it's thank you all for listening into the Sikh Network, and keep up supporting Khalsa TV. It's your television. The more you own it, the more you can help us promote it. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.